The Vietnam War was one of the biggest causes in the rise of the anti-war movement in the United States, with 60,000 American lives lost only to see their enemy take over the entire region. Located on the Indochina Peninsula, Vietnam gained independence in a war against the Southern Han Kingdom in the 10th century after decades of occupation by various Chinese kingdoms. It survived as an independent nation until 1859, when it was invaded by the French Empire as part of what was known as French Indochina, consisting also of modern-day Laos and Cambodia. In September 1940, the Japanese Empire invaded Indochina and made it a puppet state, but this only lasted until they surrendered it as part of the Potsdam Declaration at the end of the Second World War, which took away all their conquered land outside of Japan. The British and French took temporary control of the south, with the Republic of China taking control of the north. On the same day, a Vietnamese nationalist group known as the Viet Minh, named after the communist leader Ho Chi Minh, declared independence as the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, founding a purposefully similar system to that of the United States. With Chiang Kai-shek's Chinese forces unable to maintain order in the north and the Chinese Civil War restarting against the Chinese communists, they quickly withdrew from Indochina. Despite the US being sympathetic towards Vietnamese independence, they cooperated with Britain and France to take control of the south because of the Viet Minh's communist ideology. With anarchy and chaos erupting in the north, the Viet Minh were effectively forced to allow France to regain control of all of Indochina, under the promise that the three nations would be given some autonomy, albeit under the French Union. Negotiations between France and the Viet Minh broke down within a year though, leading to the Viet Minh fighting the French using guerrilla warfare in what would be known as the First Indochina War in December 1946. The Viet Minh found an ally in the Soviet Union who supplied them with money and weapons, while the United States and the United Kingdom continued to back their ally France in one of the first of many proxy wars in the Cold War. The Soviet Union had helped forces loyal to the Communist Party in China win the Civil War there in 1950, forcing the rule of Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang government to the island of Taiwan, where they remain today. Mao Zedong's new Communist People's Republic of China also aided the Communist Viet Minh against the anti-Communist French. With the French army being defeated in the battle for strategic parts of the city of Dien Bien Phu, a ceasefire was brought about in May 1954. Peace talks were held in Geneva, Switzerland between the People's Republic of China, the Soviet Union, France, the US and the UK. The resulting agreement, known as the Geneva Accords, saw Vietnam temporarily split in two around the 17th parallel. This brought control to both sides, largely based on the land they controlled at the time, with France controlling the south and the Viet Minh controlling the north. It also set a plan for both sides to leave within 2 years and for Vietnam to be reunited upon a nationwide election in July 1956. Former French colonies Laos and Cambodia were granted independence. The split of Vietnam saw the creation of a northern and southern region, the north being communist and the south being largely capitalist, similar to North and South Korea. North Korea immediately opened up relations with its Vietnamese ally. The South's Prime Minister Ngo Dinh Diem was vehemently anti-communist and immediately began quashing any communist sentiment among the South Vietnamese by executing and imprisoning tens of thousands of communists. The US continued to back him though, regardless of how brutal a leader he became. The South's treatment of communists turned many of its civilians against the government and more communist uprisings began. The Communist North saw itself as the legitimate government of all of Vietnam and began its mission to liberate the South from what it saw as anti-communist imperialism. With tensions rising between the two regions, the scheduled reuniting elections never took place, partially because the US didn't want a nationwide vote in the government as they felt there was a lot of support for communism in Vietnam. The North created the militant group the Viet Cong in 1960, which was joined by anti-Westerners living in the South. They used guerrilla warfare by attacking southern troops and bases under the cover of night, before disappearing into the jungles and returning to their jobs by day, mostly as farmers and agricultural workers. Their aim was to take control of the South and reunite with the North to create an independent socialist Vietnam. North Vietnam assisted the Viet Cong by building dirt roads and mountain and river crossings through the border with Laos, which led into South Vietnam through Cambodia. This became known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The US feared that a takeover of South Vietnam by the communist powers could lead to the other allies in the region being taken over too, which was coined by President Eisenhower as the domino theory. The US couldn't overthrow the communist regimes because of the risk of nuclear war, meaning they had successful attempts to contain communist influence and stop it spreading. This in part meant forming an alliance with non-communist countries in the Southeast Asian and Pacific region, as well as strengthening ties with Japan, Taiwan, South Korea and then South Vietnam. The Soviet Union and Communist China allied with the North and encouraged its aggression. The South's vulnerability to communist attacks prompted President John F. Kennedy to send in 400 American advisors in May 1961. With the Viet Cong capturing more and more rural land in South Vietnam, Prime Minister Diem turned to the Kennedy administration for help by requesting ground troops. Kennedy continued to send US troops, albeit still as advisors to train the South Vietnamese military. Later that year, Kennedy authorised the beginning of Operation Ranch Hand, which was the use of a chemical infamously known as Agent Orange on South Vietnamese agricultural lands to starve the Viet Cong guerrillas of natural supplies. 75 million litres of it were sprayed, mostly on forested land, but had side effects on lots of civilians, and Vietnam's government estimated that 4 million were exposed to it, 75% of whom suffered severe illnesses. The brutality of Prime Minister Diem eventually led to him being killed in a coup, around 20 days before Kennedy's death. Kennedy's replacement Lyndon Johnson continued his policy of assisting South Vietnam's new leaders with weapons, finance and advisors. By the summer of 1964, there were over 16,000 US personnel in South Vietnam, training their military and maintaining their bases in the fight against the Viet Cong. Johnson had also sent US ships to patrol around the North Vietnamese coast and the Gulf of Tonkin. In early August, 2 reports emerged of US patrol ships being sunk by North Vietnamese torpedoes, resulting in the US Congress passing the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which allowed the US to use direct military force in Vietnam. North Vietnam had not directly invaded or even attacked the South, but had supported the advancement of the Viet Cong by supplying them with weaponry. They saw the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution as a declaration of war by the United States, and their Viet Cong proxy fighters launched 2 firebombs on US Navy bases in the South, first in November 1964, then February 1965, killing a total of 12 Americans. President Johnson tried to bully the North into withdrawing their support for the Viet Cong, so he launched a bombing campaign known as Operation Rolling Thunder. The end of the Korean War 11 years before had been achieved by bombing North Korea's power stations and other facilities, crippling their economy and forcing them into an armistice to stop the bombing. Johnson hoped to achieve the same thing in Vietnam, but underestimated the North's ability to defend against airstrikes from the ground, as many US planes were shot down. North Vietnam were also highly effective in fixing the destruction caused by the airstrikes. With the airstrikes being ineffective and ground personnel on high alert for Viet Cong attacks, the US commanders stationed on the ground asked President Johnson to send in ground troops. On March 8th, Johnson sent 3,500 Marine fighters into South Vietnam, though he knew this would only cause unrest amongst the American public as it grew into a larger war. 3 weeks later, Viet Cong terrorists detonated a car bomb outside the US Embassy in the South capital Saigon, killing 22. This in part prompted US military commander General Westmoreland to ask President Johnson for permission to use the US ground troops to directly attack the Viet Cong forces and drive them out of South Vietnam. Johnson immediately granted this and also promised to send more troops over the next few months, but this was kept secret from the American public at first. The US military began bombing strategic territory held by the Viet Cong, which resulted in the first signs of the anti-war sentiment growing in the US, as rallies started over the next few months, some supporting the war but most opposing it, with some even taking place in the major cities of Europe. The first major US ground offensive was in late August at a vital South Vietnamese seaport at Chu Lai, where an American base was stationed. The Viet Cong were ready to form a ground offensive to capture the base, so the US used their power in the sea and the air to strike the Viet Cong positions and weaken them, before using their ground troops to capture their fighters. This successful operation saw confidence grow of driving the Viet Cong out of the country. By October 1965, 150,000 US ground troops were in South Vietnam and were soon joined by battalions from their allies from the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, an alliance signed in 1954 to defend against communism in Asia. The first direct engagement between North Vietnamese and American ground forces took place in Ia Drang Valley in mid-November, where US ground troops were sent in by helicopter to fight the North Vietnamese army, known as the NVA. They were supported by US airstrikes in the opposition, which led to the NVA eventually retreating into the thick Vietnamese jungles with around 2,000 casualties compared to just 200 American ones. The combination of airstrikes and ground troops had proven effective for the US, but it exposed a weakness to the NVA, that their air forces were put in a difficult position if there was risk of hitting their own ground troops. The NVA tactic of remaining close to their enemy on the ground would work in their favour for the rest of the war. With more Viet Cong terror attacks in southern cities which were supported by the North, Lyndon Johnson tried a different tactic. He halted all bombings of North Vietnam in hope of making peace with them, focusing US attention on rooting out the Viet Cong in the south. The North Vietnamese government believed this to be hiding a secret plan between the US and the south and refused to make peace, continuing to support Viet Cong aggression. By New Year in 1966, the US had 185,000 troops in the south to fight the Viet Cong, who now controlled around half the south's countryside, and the NVA, around 35,000 of whom had entered the south through the Ho Chi Minh Trail. With North Vietnam continuing to both assist the Viet Cong and fight the US troops in the south, Johnson lifted the halt on bombing them at the end of January. This time the White House became much more strict on the bombing procedures, closely monitoring them so that they would only hit approved targets, like military bases, factories and weapon transportation lines. New York Senator Robert Kennedy, brother of John, openly criticised President Johnson's decision to restart the bombing, which didn't sit well with Johnson. Tensions at home were high amongst the American public, with the war growing even more unpopular following the reignition of the bombing campaign. To try and ease tensions, US Defence Secretary Robert McNamara stated that the aim was not to overthrow the Northern government, but to try and force them into an armistice. Oregon Senator Wayne Morse, who was one of only 2 senators to vote against the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, led an attempt to repeal it on March 1st to take back the power from President Johnson, only to be heavily defeated once again in the Senate. Continued northern aggression led to the US bombing the North's most vital source of goods, its seaport in Haiphong. US military generals both in Vietnam and at home were split on the issue of whether to directly attack the North's capital, with fears of creating more support for the North by China or the Soviet Union. After bombing NVA troops in the demilitarized zone between the North and the South, North Vietnam did gain financial support, first by China in August, then the Soviet Union in October. Delegates from the US and their allies in Southeast Asia met in the Philippines later that month, aiming to end the war peacefully now that the 2 communist world powers were involved. They announced that they would withdraw all the troops from Vietnam within 6 months if the North withdrew their support for the Viet Cong and withdrew their own troops from the South. Lyndon Johnson also offered North Vietnam a swap deal for prisoners of war, only for it to be rejected. He later stated that there was no sign of any desire amongst the North to put an end to the war following more attacks in South Vietnamese cities by the NVA and Viet Cong. 1967 saw the beginning of Operation Popeye, the use of chemicals in an operation called cloud seeding to extend the monsoon season. The aim would be to create more prolonged rainfall and dampen the path of the Ho Chi Minh Trail to make it more muddy and less useful. With over half the villages in South Vietnam's rural areas now controlled by the Viet Cong by July 1967, North Vietnam stepped up their attempts to annex the South with long-term plans that would see fierce fighting for a full year. The NVA began attacking the South's rural territory to try and lure US and Southern ground troops out of the cities, which would cause a problem for the South's forces. In August, the California governor, a certain Ronald Reagan, tried to persuade Johnson to pull the troops out of Vietnam, citing the difficulty of so many off-limit areas to attack with airstrikes. Protests and marches against the war continued in the US, with some even becoming violent. The war intensified when 2 US fighter jets bombing North Vietnam were shot down by China, having accidentally crossed the border. By the end of 1967, over 460,000 US troops were in South Vietnam, and it was thought that they were facing around 300,000 Viet Cong and NVA fighters. On January 21st, 20,000 NVA seized the US military base in the city of Dalat, which only ended after American fighter planes dropped over 100,000 tons of explosives on the enemy fighters. With the US ground troops preoccupied by the advance of the NVA in the South's rural areas, the Viet Cong staged an attack known as the Tet Offensive on its urban areas at the end of January, trying to encourage its people to join them, but it failed. One of the most infamous parts of this war, known as the My Lai Massacre, would soon follow on March 16th, where 300 Vietnamese civilians were killed. US ground troops and air forces opened fire on them, mistaking them for Viet Cong fighters. Some American media outlets went to Saigon and captured footage of the Viet Cong ambushes and civilian deaths inflicted by US troops, which was broadcast back home. Johnson decided to stop sending more troops, and at the end of March he announced he wouldn't run for another term as president because of the war in Vietnam. In another attempt to end the war peacefully, Johnson asked North Vietnam to attend the peace talks in Paris to stop the fighting, under the condition that they withdraw from the South. The North refused, which stalled them out. Johnson again stopped the bombing of North Vietnam on October 31st, 1968, hoping to find some compromise. The next week, Republican nominee Richard Nixon won the US presidential election, vowing to take the US out of Vietnam and ease relations with China and the Soviet Union. Representatives of North Vietnam and the Viet Cong did join those of the US and South Vietnam in the Paris peace talks in January 1969, but the continued Viet Cong and NVA attacks in South Vietnam led to President Nixon threatening to resume the bombing campaign in the North. The North responded by stating that they wanted Viet Cong involvement in a coalition government in the South. In March, Nixon sent out a secret order to the US Air Force to bomb North Vietnamese supply lines leading into Cambodia, only for it to be leaked to the public by the New York Times. Meanwhile, he changed US tack in the Vietnam War as he had promised in his presidential campaign, beginning the process of what was known as Vietnamization, in other words, handing the US occupied territory and military responsibility over to the South Vietnamese. He made public his so-called Nixon Doctrine in July, stating that the US would support nations facing communist aggression financially and militarily, but would no longer send in their own ground troops. Despite this, the stalling Paris peace talks saw Nixon continue military action against communist fighters in Southeast Asia, including an invasion of neighbouring Cambodia in April 1970 to fight the communist Khmer Rouge led by Pol Pot. By the summer though, US withdrawal in Southeast Asia advanced, and in the space of 7 weeks the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was repealed, the US withdrew from Cambodia, and finally South Vietnamese troops replaced the American ones on the front lines. Vietnamization began to work for Nixon, with the South Vietnamese troops holding their own against NVA and Viet Cong attacks in their own country, as well as against the communist forces in their invasions of Cambodia and Laos throughout 1971. The American public, desperate for US involvement to end, remained trusting that Nixon would keep his word, and he won the 1972 presidential election by the biggest margin in US history, winning an incredible 49 of 50 states. He tried to make a breakthrough with the North after years of gridlock in the peace talks, and it wasn't until the end of 1972 that the North even agreed to continue discussions due to the heavy US campaign of airstrikes on their capital Hanoi and most vital seaports in Haiphong. The Accords were signed by the four parties on January 27, 1973, and saw the end of US involvement in Vietnam, exchange of prisoners of war, and a ceasefire in the South. The North troops in Viet Cong were allowed to remain in the South, meaning some of the South was controlled by its government and the rest by the Viet Cong. Nixon had promised to aid the South in case the North or Viet Cong violated the Accords. In June of that year though, the US Congress passed the Case Church Amendment, which banned US military action in Southeast Asia, effectively giving a green light to the communist aggressors in Vietnam, as well as Cambodia and Laos. The next year, Nixon resigned facing impeachment following the Watergate scandal, resulting in Vice President Gerald Ford becoming president. Ford was the seventh and final president who had to deal with Vietnam in some form. In December, North Vietnam tested Ford by attacking the South, violating the Paris Peace Accords, but Ford was blocked from intervening militarily. The next month he stated that the US were unwilling to re-enter the war. Over the next 2 months, North Vietnam and the Viet Cong began invasions on the South, from both north of the border and from the Viet Cong's territory there. President Ford wanted to keep the US promise to the South and support them financially in resisting the North, but was unable to get the support this time from the newly elected Congress. The Democrats had won a majority in the House and Senate, mostly due to anger amongst the American public over the war in Vietnam. The Democrats were largely opposed to the war as well, meaning that funds to South Vietnam were blocked. With South Vietnam's army being overrun by the North, the South's President Thieu resigned on April 21st, eventually fleeing to Taiwan. On April 30th, the last US representatives left the embassy in the South's capital Saigon before it was captured by the North's advance. South Vietnam surrendered, bringing northern controls to the whole nation, and in the same month, communist regimes also emerged in Laos and Cambodia. On July 2, 1976, official reunification effectively ended the states of North and South Vietnam and saw the formation of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, which still exists today. The South's former capital Saigon was renamed Ho Chi Minh City. Around 2 million civilians died during the 20 years of fighting in Vietnam, and there were thought to be up to 250,000 deaths amongst the South's troops and nearly 60,000 among American ones. Despite winning the war in the end, North Vietnam and the Viet Cong combined suffered nearly 3 times as many deaths as their enemies. Some sources estimate nearly 1 million Southerners who had been loyal to the South or who had been outed as anti-communist were sent to prison camps, known as re-education camps, where nearly a quarter of them died. The success of the US and their allies in Korea to halt communist expansion brought about complacency when it came to protecting South Vietnam. The North's ability to use the jungle landscapes and the Ho Chi Minh Trail through neighbouring countries to assist them in their fight was not an issue in Korea, but was an unexpected burden on the US in Vietnam. When people think back to the Vietnam War, they tend to think of the most horrific aspects of it, many of which still linger today, such as the hereditary effects of the Agent Orange chemical still being suffered by civilian survivors of it, as well as many of their children and grandchildren. The US's failure to halt the aggression in Southeast Asia saw communism prevail in Vietnam's neighbours, leading to massive refugee crises in the South China Sea, and the genocidal Cambodian regime of Pol Pot slaughtered at least 1.5 million people. Presidents Eisenhower, Kennedy and others believed in the domino effect, that Vietnam falling to communism could lead to much of Southeast Asia following it, and they appear to have been right.